Welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. My name is Brian Gigantino. When state socialism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union collapsed between 1989 and 1992, not only did millions of people find themselves in independent countries, but they were also all of a sudden living in what many so-called experts and opportunistic politicians referred to as societies and economies in quote-unquote transition. The concept of transition worked from the assumption that capitalism and democracy, as imagined in the West, would be the post-communist world's natural endpoint now that capitalist globalization had been rid of its biggest historical obstacle, state socialism in the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries. But capitalist markets, just like a socio-economic transition to them, are anything but natural processes. In fact, creating market economies in former communist countries required a heavy-handed political and social intervention in order to deconstruct and destroy societies and their interdependence on each other that state socialism had spent decades building. This destructive development of markets across a vast part of the globe was largely led by teams of economists who sincerely believed that the universal potential of marketization could be explained alone by economic orthodoxy, groundless models, and abstract projections. The rapid and destructive application of market reforms throughout the communist world was called shock therapy. Shock therapy led to a cataclysmic social crisis for the vast majority. Living standards, demographic trends, political stability, and economic growth in general plummeted to abysmal levels. Decades of sociality and collective political coherence were actively replaced by logics of individual consumerism and utopian fantasies of Western-led globalization. This mixed global and local logic of markets ushered in an era where families, neighborhoods, and colleagues, as well as regions and even entire countries, were suddenly being mediated by an economic logic that celebrated and rewarded individualism and ethno-nationalism in ways unlike ever before. However, for a very small percentage of people, things seemed to be getting better. This minority was held up as a celebrated example that Western financial institutions and local elites could use in order to justify repeating over and over again for decades the successes of shock therapy and the benevolence of the new capitalist arrangement. But across the former communist world, the vast majority lost out. Now, far-right nationalists are taking advantage of the decades of simmering working-class discontent and resentment that the unyielding travesty of socialist collapse has ushered in and deepened in the absence of an alternative internationalist political program focused on the working population and their needs. But how can we compare the varied, yet still intimately connected and similar results of state socialism's collapse across Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, Russia, and Central Asia? Luckily, Kristen Ghodsee and Mitchell Ornstein have done just that in their excellent new book, which I highly recommend everybody read, called Taking Stock of Shock: The Social Consequences of the 1989 Revolutions. On today's episode of Reimagining Soviet Georgia, myself, Sopo Japaridze, and Becca Natsvlishvili are lucky to have Kristen Ghodsee and Mitchell Ornstein on as guests to discuss their new book, Taking Stock of Shock, how they wrote it, and how their findings relate to the decades of egregious and socially destructive market reforms in post-communist Georgia. Mitchell Orenstein and Kristen Ghodsee, thank you so much for joining us on Reimagining Soviet Georgia. So please, why don't you guys introduce yourselves?
All right, so my name is Kristen Ghodsee. I am a professor of Russian and East European Studies and a member of the graduate group in anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. And I am an anthropologist and ethnographer. I've been studying the region for the better part of 25 years. I'm actually in Belgrade right now, talking to you from the heart of the Balkans, I suppose. And I am really interested primarily in women's issues and sort of gender and transition and the impacts that the move from state socialism to capitalism has had on ordinary people's lives. And I have written a number of books on this topic. And most recently, obviously, I collaborated with Mitchell on Taking Stock of Shock, where we really try to get to come to terms and get an understanding of the actual sort of empirical reality of these various discourses that are floating around the region.
Yeah, hi, my name is Mitchell Ornstein. I'm a political economy scholar of Central and Eastern Europe. I've been working on the region, like Kristen, since 1990, basically. In fact, also traveled to Prague in 1987. So I had at least a little bit of a glimpse at how things looked under communism as well. But I've been initially was interested in the politics of economic reform in the region and why, how countries were kind of managing reform while also trying to build democracy, kind of a big puzzle. And then I've sort of branched out, in studying a lot of different types of policy reforms, pension privatization, flat tax, a lot of the neoliberal reforms that spread throughout the region. And with a primary emphasis on the Visegrad countries, but also, increasingly the region as a whole. And I'm also a professor of Russian and East European Studies at University of Pennsylvania, and also political science, which is kind of my home discipline. Although, like Kristen, I've worked in a number of different disciplines. My work crossing over into economics, into sociology primarily, with social welfare state, kind of emphasis, and international relations, many other areas. So I think that like who we are is we're both kind of interdisciplinary scholars of Russia and East Europe and post-communist transition. And we actually worked in parallel. I don't think we actually ever met one another, Kristen, for the first like 25 years that we were working on the region, or even actually heard of one another, probably because of being in different disciplines. And I think that's what really made this book extremely important, for both of us, and I think for the field as a whole, that we were finally able to have a kind of interdisciplinary conversation about this, an honest one. And what was striking to us initially when we got working on this project was just how disparate, how far apart our disciplinary perspectives were. So we came at this with an understanding that, wow, we've grown up in this discipline, and by the way, in also different regional contexts, and therefore have completely opposite views, honestly, about what the transition produced. And unfortunately, that's not surprising. That's kind of typical. What we found in working on this book is that people in different social science disciplines, as well as with different political leanings in the region itself, have completely opposite perspectives about the socioeconomic impact of 1989 revolutions, right? And I think what was special about this book and our collaboration in this book was that we were both willing to have that conversation, willing to have a sort of an honest interchange. We both saw ourselves as interdisciplinary, right, and willing to have those conversations, and willing to learn, from the other side, willing to, and honestly, although we had quite different perspectives, and probably to some extent, have somewhat different perspectives, actually, the writing of this book was very, very easy for us. We worked, I think, very easily together. Our process was that Kristen drafted certain chapters initially, and I drafted certain chapters initially, but then we traded chapters and reworked them how we wanted. And there was no point, there's no sentence in the book, I can be quite sure, that both Kristen and I don't both agree on, right? So we've combed it many, many times, and any areas of disagreement were changed, altered, and it was never, I don't think, maybe Kristen had a different opinion, but it was never hard to find a compromise language or a compromise argument or something we could both be happy with.
Yeah, I mean, I would, no, I would agree with that. I mean, I definitely think that I tend to write more politically, and to the extent that I feel like we tried to remain neutral in this book, to try to remain above the fray. That to me was a little different than what I would normally do. And I think that's because part of the collaboration was to try to appeal to people working in the policy realm at the World Bank or the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or even at the EU level, who knows where, in different policy circles. I think that there's a need to kind of say, here's the data, here is our interpretation of the data, and these interpretations are different depending on where you are in the region and depending on who you are within the region and even within the country. And so these two narratives are both correct. And what I don't think we did, I think to the extent that we kind of passed judgment on that, we said, look, there was a different way. There was this Chinese model that didn't require shock therapy, that didn't require rapid privatization, that didn't require all of these things. And that still led to economic growth, in fact, greater levels of economic growth and less pain than the East European model. And we got a little bit of flack for that, I think. I think one of the anonymous reviewers kind of pushed back and said that the Chinese model wasn't relevant here. And besides, it's not a democracy. And all these countries in Eastern Europe are now beautiful democracies, right? So I think that there was to the extent at the end of the book, I think there was a little bit of holding back on my part, because, at certain points during the book, I would, read the data, or especially just talking to people in Bulgaria. I've been in Bulgaria, I'm now in Serbia, just talking to people about how bad things are right now. And again, I think the other big difference between Mitchell and I is that Mitchell tended to work in former Czechoslovakia, Czechia, and Hungary and Poland, which are wealthier, more northern, more integrated European countries. And most of my work has tended to be down here in the Balkans. I mean, Serbia is still not in the EU, right? And I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. And I just walked by, a massive pro-Russian sort of celebration somewhere. And I can tell you that there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of nostalgia among the older generation here, as well as in Bulgaria. But the thing that I find really interesting is there's a kind of vacuum on the left in terms of leftist parties that are really trying to address some of these systemic problems with neoliberalism and privatization and all of the things that have happened in transition in the last 30 years. Now, that seems to be changing in places like Croatia and Slovenia, where you have these interestingly kind of emergent democratic type socialist parties that are more akin to like Die Linke in Germany, or even closer maybe to the Belgian Workers' Party. So I think things are changing. But one of the things that you mentioned in your introduction, or before we started recording, was that oftentimes, there's this story that no matter how bad the transition was, it was worth it because everything that came before was so terrible and bad. And I think that the only way to kind of address the narrative of all of this incredible pain and all these lives that have been sacrificed and all of the anxiety and psychosocial stress and all the things that everybody in this region has been through, and I could make that list really long if you wanted me to, was all worth it because, yes, communism was Stalin and the Gulag and famines, and it was evil, and so therefore it had to end no matter what. And I think that, first of all, one of the arguments that is often made about socialism as it existed in the 20th century is that it was, an economic catastrophe. And I think one of the things that the book does really well is to show that what came after socialism was pretty catastrophic as well. So if your basis for the legitimacy of a political or economic system is its economic efficacy, you kind of have a problem making the argument that one was better than the other. So let's just put it that way. The question of democracy is a different thing. But I agree with Mitchell that it was very easy to write this book in the sense that we collaborated very well. We had a wonderful research assistant who was an economist, or I guess he was studying economics at the time. He's now gone into political science, but he was really, really excellent at anytime we had a question, what data do we need? What are the numbers? Nicholas would run off and find, all of these wonderful data sources and sort of do some number crunching where Mitchell and I could then hash out what it was we wanted to do. And I don't know, Mitchell, if you want to talk about the index that we initially thought we would prepare.
Yeah. I mean, okay, that's a good point. So I want to say two things. One is that when Kristen mentions her discomfort at certain things when we're writing, that was not in dialogue with me. That was in dialogue with our critics.
And it was, with our critics, right?
In the review process for the book, it was sent to certain neoliberal scholars.
Yes, and that was really a problem.
I've always felt that people on that side of things, they're an important, that's an audience we're trying to reach, right? And so what we made a decision at some point, and it's important because they're in the international organizations. We actually thought that our book would influence people in international organizations. In fact, we organized a conference together with the World Bank, as a part of this, because in those organizations, that they're also people who are rethinking, the strategy. You may not see that in, say, healthcare in Georgia, advice, but there are people in the bank who are rethinking what the results were. And so we were intentionally trying to reach that audience. And as a result, we made the decision later in the book to, at the behest of reviewers, to focus the book entirely on what we would call in political science the dependent variable, like what happened, right?
Right.
And not at all on why it happened, right? So we don't say anything in the book at all about whether this was a result of communism, whether this was a result of neoliberal reforms, whether this was a result of sunspots, or whatever,
international banking conspiracies, whatever. Yeah.
We decided the big issue was really that nobody even agreed what happened. And so if you can't look at the result of what happened, if you can't see it, as a lot of people I don't think can, then you can't explain it either, right? And so this was in a way a first step to sort of invite debate about, okay, what is this a really correct picture, and then what happened? Why did it end up this way? So as a result of that, and turning to the data strategy, what we initially thought, we had initially some ideas which turned out to be wrong, right? So our first idea was that there were two visions. There was a J-curve analysis and a disaster capitalism analysis of what happened in the transition. And one of those had to be right? They could not both be right. So we initially got into saying, okay, I think this, you think that, let's gather together some interdisciplinary data and we'll know which is right and which is not right, right? And so this was very much, I think, a really important thing we were trying to do. We were trying to, and our strategy was trying to say, okay, let's not just look at economic data, which tends to be how people will look at it. But we're also going to look at demographic data, which we knew to be extremely disturbing, and also to ethnographic data, which we also knew revealed a lot of things that were never discussed in economics, and not even in political science, although political science research tends to have a lot more interview techniques and even in-country cultural experience. So my research, for instance, was based on field work from years learning the language, et cetera. It's still a different level than anthropology, but we're much more in that direction than economics is, for instance. Right? And then also we looked at public opinion research, because that's a kind of, in a way, a middle ground between detailed anthropological studies, which tend to be very close to the ground and in one locale, and a sort of broader perspective on what people were thinking about the transition. And so those were the areas we initially got into, and we decided to get as much data as possible. And so as a result, we hired a research assistant who Kristen mentioned, who's now a PhD student at UCLA, who is, is a fantastic researcher and basically pulled together a lot of publicly available data sets. Some of them were easy to compile, and others were very not easy to compile. In particular, the public opinion proved extremely challenging because we found that nobody had actually collected public opinion about transition in all the countries. And Kristen's point on this, which I guess I sort of agree with, is like, maybe they didn't really care what people thought about it.
They didn't. You guys didn't have a choice. I mean, people in the region, who cares what you thought? It's not like you could do anything about it, right?
Yeah.
So,
but in case
yeah.
So let me just finish on the data thing. So the data thing, we pull all this data together, and our idea was to create a massive index, a massive data source, and then to create an index of how well transition was going in different countries, based on these multiple different indicators. And then we realized that that was like a pretty bad idea for sort of methodological reasons, which I'm now forgetting, but having to do with the fact that they're all sort of correlated with one another to some extent. So we, and basically it was too, the data was too multidimensional in a lot of ways, right? So it didn't, so basically the data on mortality, which one of the things we were initially really surprised at is if you look where people are dying, it's not necessarily the same place where the economic crisis is the worst. The economic crisis, by the way, is much worse in Central Asia, but in Central Asia, people don't die because of transition to the same extent as they do in Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. And the reason is cultural, basically. It's essentially to do with alcohol. What's that? Yeah, it's to do with alcohol.
Yeah.
Vodka, or actually samagon,
Yeah.
And then other people whose life expectancy may be increasing, like Serbia is an interesting case where life expectancy didn't really dip that much after the transition, but a lot of people left the country. So there's huge outmigration. That tends to be in other countries, right, that are Southeast Europe, that happen to be closer to the EU. Right. And so it's more available and they're culturally more similar and able to integrate, so they go to the EU, and that causes this huge emptying out of some places. So basically different countries are experiencing, except for the Visegrad countries, which are fine on everything. Everywhere else is experiencing one or another type of massive crisis after transition, but not always the same crisis. So I think that was one of the first insights we had out of the data. And then we published all the data on our website, takingstockofshock.com, and so it's available for everybody else to analyze, as well as producing a sort of bibliography of the anthropological research on the region, which can't be quantified exactly, And so we published that as well on our website. So that was kind of, in a nutshell, our data strategy. Our finding, and here's a surprising finding, that I'll let Kristen say more about this, is that the surprising finding is that both of these major narratives are right, or we found really strong evidence to support both the J-curve, perspective on transition, and to support the disaster capitalism narrative on transition. But it depended. So there were some people in the region, as you probably know well, and this is a part where when I say this, I often see people's wheels spinning, and you can see them thinking or seeing things that maybe they sort of perceived in the past but didn't really know. But in the same country, you have people that are enjoying the J-curve transition, are doing amazingly well. I'm sure you see that in Georgia. And there's a lot of people who are suffering like the worst economic calamity ever in modern history. And that's part of what I think makes the transition so difficult to understand, and why different fields and different people have had such just totally disparate views about what happened.
Yeah, I think the other thing, just to tack onto that, was part of the problem with our initial idea of doing the index, and part of the problem with any of the quantitative data, is that the nation state is taken as the unit. of analysis. And precisely what Mitchell just said is that if you aggregate the nation state, the way that GDP per capita works, if one person has all the money and everybody else has none, the GDP, it gets averaged out, right? So if you don't look at inequality, and if you don't look at the way that resources have been distributed within the national context, you're missing a big, huge part of the story. And so that's precisely why economists were able to kind of double down on the J-curve narrative, because they only looked at the nation state as the unit of analysis. And that allowed for them to hide or ignore, and again, whether this was willful or not is a big question, the reality that so many people were suffering, but it doesn't show up necessarily in the economic data because it sort of gets averaged out. And I think that that's a really big, important part of the story that Mitchell and I are telling, is that there's this huge swath of the population, even in parts of rural Poland or rural Hungary, for instance, countries that are doing relatively well, that are responsible for the rise of some of these right-wing parties because they're so angry about what has happened over the last 30 years.
And just for like listeners, can you explain what the J curve is? Because this is a hugely important part of your book. And I think this is like how the book even starts. And can you just do a brief explanation of what that is for people who are listening?
And disaster capitalism, like just a brief explanation, yeah.
Well, I mean, the J-curve idea is essentially the idea that was put forward by a lot of economists at the outset of transition, that there would be that consumption of people would follow a kind of J-curve after communism, or sort of like this. Kristen had the great. It looks like the Nike swoosh.
Nike swoosh, yeah.
So basically, you'd start here, and things would go down a bit, and then, but eventually things would go up, right? So they thought that people would suffer after the transition, but it would be not a big deal, and it would only last a couple years, and then everybody would be doing so much better afterwards. Real transition, however, in a lot of countries followed more of a disaster, track,
which was just down.
Georgia, is kind of faced this, I think, where it was more like a U curve. And so the difference is that it was much deeper. Georgia, according to official data, lost like 60% of its economy, much, much deeper than the Great Depression in the United States, which still, by the way, is talked about in the US and shapes all sorts of economic policies in the US. And it also lasted for much, much, much longer. So the US economy after the Great Depression came back to where it was, within 10 years. It bottomed out after 3 years and was back to where it had started in, I think, 7 years or something. In average post-communist country, it lasted, the recession didn't bottom out for 10 years. So that's like 3 times longer than the Great Depression, and didn't come back until about 20 years later. And I was just looking before where Georgia fits on that. But yeah, it looks like the Georgian economy, I don't know, had 2 depressions. So it bottomed out in 94, and then it hit the bottom again in 1999. So it's kind of typical, and it really didn't come back to 1990 levels until 2006, which is kind of average, really. So you're talking about a 17-year period where things are worse. And so, the expectation is that, okay, well, one or both of these narratives have to be right because they seem so contradictory. But in fact, what we find is that there are a lot of countries that suffered, as Georgia did, in this kind of disaster capitalism, way, and with all sorts of consequences for Georgian politics, that you're kind of living through. And then there are other countries that, had a kind of 2 or 3 year drop and then went up. So in the Visegrad countries in general, they followed a path that was not dissimilar from the Great Depression. Whereas what Georgia went through is honestly the worst economic collapse in modern history in any set of countries that we've measured. And we get that data from the Madison Project, which is a big historical project, which has been seeking to find, GDP figures in all countries of the world back to the 1500s. And, their conclusion is that this is the worst ever, or that data shows that it's the worst ever economic crisis in modern times, worse than the economic crisis of the Second World War, for instance, which you could say it was very bad probably, but it lasted from 39 to 45 or 47 maybe on the outside. So it was probably half as long as what happened in Georgia or other post-communist countries.
Absolutely. You know, I'm just reviewing this new book that's just come out. I'm not even sure it's out in the US. It's out in the UK. It's called Free: Coming of Age at the End of History by Leah Ypi. Highly recommend it. It's an Albanian personal family history of the transition in Albania leading up to the 1997 civil war that killed like 2,000 people and led to the entire economy collapse because of these pyramid schemes. And I mean, obviously, sitting here in Serbia, in Belgrade, you have to think about the Yugoslav wars as well. And, you know, just in addition to the economic collapses, which were significant, you also had just sort of war and absolute internal strife. She talks a lot about the outmigration, for instance, from Albania in the 90s, and these boats of the images of these boats like overflowing with Albanians sort of lumbering their way towards the Italian coast and sort of trying and being turned around, and these people, you know, on these boats 72 hours, you know, they're like parched. It's the image of these desperate East Europeans trying to get out in those early years of the 90s as their economies were collapsing, as you had the rise of the mafia, you have these pyramid schemes that wiped out everybody's savings. I mean, it was catastrophic above and beyond, right? The economic depression and the privatization, right? There were all these social consequences that I think are also really important. And what I love about this book, I have to say, it's after maybe Jana Hensel's book, Zonenkinder, about Eastern Germany, it's one of the first really sort of heartfelt and beautifully written books about a kind of personal experience of transition that really kind of calls out capitalism for all of the damage that it did to people's lives in the 90s. And I think that's pretty impressive, to be honest, because I haven't seen a book like this for like the mainstream Western publishing media in a while.
There's this film named called Klopka, which is like I think it's like a Serbian film where like there's no healthcare anymore, and like this guy's son needs like a surgery, and so he has to like get in bed with the mafia to do something for them to get the money for the surgery. And I was like, that's like Klopka is like a great post like communist film to show how horrible it was in Serbia. But Georgia has everything that Serbia and Balkans have, but more. We've had wars, we've had one of the worst crises in modern history, and it also just keeps going. Like it doesn't stop here. Like it doesn't. There is no relief. It's like this idea that somehow soon something will change. There's absolutely no sign of it. And plus, because we are so sort of tucked away in these mountains, sort of away from everything, very small population, we don't have a lot of like rich natural resources to sell, like oil, and really our so-called comparative advantage is free cheap labor to Europe, right? Like in the form of like care workers. So we really don't have much in this like in this sort of world order of capitalism to really leverage ourselves in any way in a very, very unstable political ruling class. So go ahead.
But yet I would say one of the things we noticed with Georgia is often touted as being like the best place in the world to do business, right? Extremely successful neoliberal economy, and in a way for most economists, I think, working in international organizations, they would see Georgia as a huge success case. And I think this speaks to exactly the kind of discontinuities that we're trying to address in this book, right? Is Georgia is actually in a way the perfect case of this, right? Where I agree with you that it's a fairly dismal picture in a lot of ways. And yet from the international point of view, they'd say everything is great. You know, everything is fantastic in Georgia. This is like the ideal kind of country you want to be, you know, is you want to be exactly like Georgia, right? And I think that's why, again, what we're trying to address is miscomprehensions, right? So how can it be that Georgia is both a model country and a disaster, right, at the same time? And I think the answer for us has to do with inequalities, and it has to do with you know, understanding that certain proportion of people in Georgia did exceptionally well. You know, it may not be a big proportion, but there are a lot of people who did great, including like what's his name, Ivanishvili, right? You know, I mean, he's like super well off, and there are, I'm sure, other sort of mini oligarchs in Georgia who are doing great. And then also there are a lot of professionals in cities, you know, like who are well educated in the capital city, who are doing great, you know, fine, you know, maybe in some ways better than they did before communism, right?
And maybe one
At the
thing,
same,
one thing to add, though, one thing to just, sorry to interrupt, but I think it's important to, at least in the Georgian case, because it's such a small
yeah,
place, that most of the oligarchs got their money from elsewhere.
yeah, yeah,
Yes, these are actually not, unlike, for example, the oligarchs who emerged in Eastern Ukraine from the mining industry, or the
right,
oil oligarchs in Russia. Someone like Bidzina Ivanishvili, or in an earlier Bendukidze. These are people who got their money elsewhere and are actually, they didn't get the billions of dollars
yeah.
from Georgia.
Well, presumably there's also like a technical and educated class that's done fairly well, I think, in Georgia, I would imagine. I mean, maybe they haven't, but I think that in general, some, you know, and then you have a lot of people who are just kind of more invisible because they tend to live outside the capital city, right, or in certain neighborhoods, and they've had a totally different experience, and that's the kind of experience it sounds like, Kristen, this book that you found, you know, sort of documents, right? And so I think what we try to do, and this is really hard, you know, for us actually in this book, is to reach a balance, you know, but we have to acknowledge both sides of this, right? Because that is, in fact, people's lived reality. Like, we know tons of people who did really well. In fact, you could also argue, some people have said, well, all the people who left, say, Georgia, right, and they're living, maybe a lot of them are doing better too, because now they're living in, I don't know where they live, but in London or wherever they're living in Germany, you know, and they're undoubtedly working and doing well, and they have a higher standard of living. And so we don't want to erase anybody's experience, right, in this. We don't want to say, okay, no, those people don't exist or they're not important. But what we do want to create is just a picture, taking these fragmented, like a shattered, you know, mirror. We want to take these fragments and sort of put them together in a kind of picture that makes sense. And the sense that we make of it is an inequalities perspective. We say, look, there were very diverse outcomes of transition. It's a kind of unique crisis, right? Because we reach for like in the Great Depression in the United States, nobody really did that great, right? People who had their money in the stock market lost everything. People on the street lost their jobs. Everybody suffered. It was like an experience of shared suffering. And I think that's also how World War II is remembered, probably how World War I is remembered. You know, there's these crises are usually experiences of shared suffering. The transition crisis was not an experience of shared suffering. It was an experience of some people suffering massively, more than they've ever done before, and some people doing amazingly well. It's, you know, and that those two things are very, very hard to keep in mind at the same time. It's an experience of growing, massively widening inequality. You know, so much so, like a disastrous level of inequality, if you will, where there's so much hope and aspiration and improvement at the same time as your neighbor down the street has so much suffering, right? And I think that's the barrier to understanding the transition, is that for humans, it's very hard to look at a crisis like that.
From the life of one member of the parliament, once it was a discussion, not a discussion, but it was a hearing of Minister for Foreign Affairs in the parliament, and I expressed the opinion that if you remember, the Putin told once that the collapse of Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical catastrophe, and I told that it is wrong, but I will refrain, it's like it was the biggest humanitarian catastrophe generally, and everybody, whole media and right wings and so on, labeled me as a pro-Putin. One of the problems in Georgia generally, especially in Georgia, I mean, that with the countries which had some disputes with Russia, territorial disputes and so on, that every time when you are talking about different approaches to development or alternative approaches to development, it understood that you are pro-Russian, you know, and it's closed somehow. It is something like gatekeeper from healthy discussion generally about the transition, about the Soviet past, about capitalism and so on and so on. Because only one word about the transition, about the collapse of Soviet Union, like even if you try to have the reflection about Soviet Union, it means that you are already pro-Russian, you know, and it is really the biggest gatekeeper, and it is damaging any kind of discussion in Georgia. I have one question about methodology, for example. Did you use some data which will show us the social mobility in these countries? Because we know that, okay, you mentioned it just a few minutes ago that, for example, Ivanishvili, Bendukidze, and so on, these are the people which made their fortunes in abroad, for example, in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But if you see Georgia, whole richest people are either the old part of nomenclatura, which grabbed their possessions during I call it second primitive accumulation after the collapse of Soviet Union, and or the, I don't know, children of them, sons, daughters, and so on, because there is no social mobility. Maybe the Visegrad countries on some different countries, I don't know, which are more closer to European Union. There are some possibilities because I've made some small research about the privatization, the ways of privatization, how it was conducted, for example, in Slovenia, and how it was done in post-socialist countries, post-Soviet countries. It was totally different because there were some labor participation institutions during the privatization. For example, in Yugoslavia and in the countries where they had some experience in the, nowadays it is called social dialogue on the factory level, but we did not have it at all, such kind of experience. So our privatization run in a different way, in more corrupt and in more violent way. So, and the second aspect is, for example, that they are close to European Union, and because they are close to European Union, they became very soon the member of the European Union. The young people, they had the opportunity to find the job and more or less good paid job legally. And for the people which are not part of the European Union and post-socialist countries, post-Soviet countries, which did not become the part of Soviet Union, for them it's quite difficult to find some legal job in the European Union, which would be more or less well paid. It means that in our case, any channel of social mobility is closed, because one channel is that, you know, the redistribution of the wealth, and we did not that don't have any institutions of redistribution of the wealth. The second is that, for example, whole wealth is concentrated in the hands of former nomenclatura or the inheritance of nomenclatura. And the third is that even if you try as a young guy to find some job abroad, to open for yourself the channel of social mobility, it is already closed because you are not a part of the European Union. And that's why my question is, do we, even on your webpage of your book, because you mentioned that we have some data with which you can operate. Could we find some data which will show us the channels of social mobility or the possibilities of social mobility generally? Because even if we take this Bourdieu classification of capital, for example, economic, cultural, social, and symbolic capital, it is redistributed very unequal in Georgia. So which is the base of social mobility? So this was my question.
Social mobility, it can be difficult, but there are studies of social mobility, right? I don't know them that well, and we don't include them in the book because it's too technical. But, and also I don't know if you can get data for all the countries. So we were initially trying to do this index. So we were trying to only use data that we could get for all the countries, and have a complete set. But I can point you in the direction. I would just look up, social mobility. We use Google Scholar. So you go to Google Scholar and you type in social mobility, you can figure out like which indicators they typically use. One other source I would say that, the way that I think this is studied to some extent, the best way to study it is doing household surveys. But you have to do it over a long period of time to really get social mobility. But to some extent, you would go around and survey people door to door. And this is done, it's like kind of the typical way that really good income studies are done. And also, you could use it for mobility as well. And I would look at this organization called the Luxembourg Income Study. And that's the one that, is kind of a consortium of European countries to sort of provide this type of data, like survey data, basically about income. But it's not done in every country or in every year in every country. And the government has to sort of pay to do it, and so not everybody does it. But, and then I think the further obstacle, in a place like one of the post-Soviet places is that people don't necessarily report their incomes, so you don't really know always from official data, what class they're in, or how much they're earning, But yeah, of course you can do that. And I hear what you're saying. It sounds like Georgia's in a unique circumstance, right? Because of not being so probably out migration is less in Georgia than if you were close to the European Union. For countries that where it's legal, it could be even super higher, right? Potentially.
Well, we don't have that many people to begin with.
But some countries are really at risk of just emptying out. I mean, Bulgaria also, may lose ultimately as much as half of its population, right? And it's interesting that that's also never been seen as a crisis. Like one of the things we thought was radical about this book is by viewing out migration as a crisis. For many people, the neoliberal perspective is it's all markets and everybody should go where their labor is most valued, and it's not a big deal if they just leave, and it wasn't until more recently that people started thinking about this as a crisis. And any crisis, of course, in Europe is the in-migration crisis. So when you come to Europe, that's a crisis, but when you leave your own country, that's not a crisis, So, I do think that all the issues you're talking about are real. It sounds like it's very specific. And yes, there are ways you can study that in comparison, obviously,
I want to address something that you said at first about how anytime you talk about the failures of transition or humanitarian catastrophe, immediately you become a pro-Putinist or pro-Russia or something. And so Mitchell, there was this article that we discussed at some point about this thing called convergence theory. And I know that term gets used differently, but when convergence theory is applied to the former socialist world, some economists, and I can't remember who wrote this article. I'll have to find it. But basically what they say is, look, some of these countries are just poor countries. And they were always poor. They will always be poor. It's not anybody's fault. It was just an exception that for a brief period of time during communism that they had this really high standard of living. But that was totally only possible under complete totalitarian conditions. And so once you took the totalitarianism away, they go back to being the poor, backward countries that they always were and always should be. And some of these economists will say, well, like, you know, because Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, they're like Europe. Had it not been for communism and Soviet imperialism, they probably would have been like Germany or France. And so even though they're still poorer than the EU, we kind of, you know, let them in the club because communism actually probably hindered their development, as opposed to places like Bulgaria or Georgia or Yugoslavia, where, you know, communism, like, yeah, it created all of this like high standards of living and roads and hospitals and schools and all those horrible things that, you know, were only sustainable under a completely centralized economy and a totalitarian government. So they got like a little bit of the taste of modernity, but they never really deserved it because they weren't democratic or whatever. And so therefore, they're just back where they should have been anyway. I mean, literally people publish this narrative, okay? Now, the irony of that narrative is, first of all, it's like disgustingly ethnocentric and racist. But worse about it, and what I find really funny, is that it actually seems to suggest that communism works really well for the development of backward countries in the global economy. And they don't seem to see that as a contradiction or a problem for their argument. You know, so I think that that's one thing that is worth pointing out when people say you're being pro-Putinist or something, or pro-Russia, is to say, but wait a minute, like we actually can look at the data here and point to purchasing power parity. We can talk about per capita income. We can talk about living standards. We can talk about all sorts of, you know, things to just, you know, just logistically, there are many, you know, we show this in the book, many people living in the former socialist world that do not, in 2018, which is the last time that we had data, have the standard of living that they had in 89 or 91, depending on where you are. That's important to point out. That's just a fact. But then the other thing that I think is really interesting, and people in the Soviet and post-Soviet and post-socialist context in Eastern Europe tend to forget, is that there still are, and there were really big, sometimes bigger, but they're still around, communist and far left parties in Western Europe. So like the Belgian Workers' Party has nothing to do with Russia, by the way, right? They sit in parliament and they're kind of like the locomotive of the left. They pull the debate to the left and they force the mainstream parties in Belgium to deal with policies that they otherwise wouldn't, like the neoliberals could get away with because they don't have a sitting opposition in parliament. You know, I think, you know, you look at like Podemos in Spain, you look at Die Linke in Germany, these different parties. So I think that it's also problematic in the post-socialist context to only code socialism or any, you know, sort of experiment with non-capitalist economic systems as Russian, as if the Russians made that up. They didn't. That's totally wrong, right? And so I think it's also worth pushing back against those sorts of narratives whenever you can, to point out that, well, okay, look, like the Belgian Workers' Party is like a Marxist-Leninist party, but they were actually originally a Maoist party, and then they went through a brief flirtation with Marxist-Leninism, and now they're just like a kind of a good left Euro-communist party, like Syriza or whatever in Greece. And so I think that it's really important to break out of the strictures of the post-Soviet narrative around Russia. And I don't remember if we cited in our book or if it's in a different book, but there's this wonderful article by my two Romanian colleagues where they talk about zombie socialism. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this article. You can Google it. It's called Zombie Socialism. And basically they're talking about the way in Romania that anytime somebody brings up like regulating the banks or taxing wealthy people at a higher rate, or building, you know, raising taxes to build new roads or to upgrade the infrastructure, they get called socialists or they get called communists, right? And so this narrative of the communist past really is very present in the contemporary moment as a way of preventing any kind of redistribution. And I think that's really important to address. And that means talking about contemporary politics, but it also means going to the data. And that's why I think that having the data on the website, as we do, anybody can go in there and crunch those numbers. We have links to all of the relevant websites, all of the relevant articles, all of the relevant sources that we use to help people understand that this is the reason that there are these two competing narratives is because the J-curve people, whose narrative is true for a certain percentage of the population, have just been much better at sort of propagating their point of view through the official channels in the last 30 years. And it's only now that you're beginning to see these dissenting voices coming not only from, I think, within the international organizations, but also from people within the former socialist world, which is really important.
So I would agree with that. I'd add, a couple things that I thought on political strategy. Like, I think what you're talking about is what's the strategy for talking about this, right? And so as soon as you talk about certain, oh yeah, things were a mess, then you're called a pro-Russian. And honestly, we have a similar type problem in the US where like there's so much anti-communist and anti-socialist rhetoric that it's very hard to also talk about those issues. But I think you have it kind of worse, right? Because you have a kind of war, in effect, a frozen conflict, if you will, which makes it much more emotional for people, and so I think honestly I wouldn't bother with that. I think that's a unwinnable rhetorical strategy. I think what I would focus on is just a tear down critique of neoliberalism, right? I mean, so the it's better probably from a rhetorical point of view to attack your opponent, then even put forward, positive programs, which I see you're putting forward, which is good. But I think the key element is you have to find a way in the public imagination to connect neoliberalism to the bad outcomes that people have, because everybody sees the bad outcomes, it sounds like, right? But they don't connect it to neoliberalism, right? So in the healthcare, for instance, you have to, put forward that, here's neoliberalism in healthcare. What is it delivered? It's delivered all these things that people don't want. And in many, many other areas, it's delivered things that people actually don't want. And then, I think as a positive program from my point of view would be to introduce, some talk about like, well, neoliberalism basically leads to inhuman outcomes that nobody can morally justify. And then that, socialism, which is a bad word, in a lot of ways, in fact, all developed economies combine both elements of capitalism and elements of socialism. Like all the Western successful countries all have probably much higher social spending than Georgia does. So why is it that everybody's moving to these countries, where they're spending more on the society? Well, it's because they actually also produce better jobs. So basically the socialism is supportive of capitalism, in a way that the neoliberals have not understand. So creating, healthcare creates more opportunity. It creates more jobs, right, in the healthcare sector, right? You were talking about the people you're planning to bring on strike, right? If you put more money into, even means testing, you're creating jobs. You pay them more, you're bumping up the economy, right? So all these things actually lead to more jobs and more economic growth. And by the way, also more support for more trade, right? So, I mean, I think that you're stronger on the negative, honestly. It sounds like the biggest issue you face is that people in Georgia, for whatever reason, are convinced still that the more neoliberalism, the better integration. But it seems like it should be easy for you to point out that the more neoliberalism has not produced anything actually very good.
I think like libertarians and neoliberals have had like a 30-year start on us. So they control all the institutions and they sort of create the sort of the atmosphere. And so that's really the big problem, right? There should be almost everyone in parliament now. If we had like any of the institutions that would challenge the liberalism set up, most of them would agree with us probably, but there is no alternative. Really,
right?
We are Thatcher's like baby, like there's
right.
like they have been able to silence and marginalize. Like, let me give you an example of how communism is very much related to neoliberal reforms, or libertarian reforms, which are, the same thing. I use them interchangeably in this context, like radical free market reforms. Like Saakashvili, the former president, left 2012 and 2011. He had two freedom things. One was a Freedom Act or Liberty Act, and one was a Freedom Charter. One outlawed communism symbolically, and one outlawed spending and progressive taxation. Yeah.
And
so
those are laws now?
It's what?
And those are laws now?
Yeah. So he did that in the Constitution. We are not allowed to have more than like 30% of spending on our budget, and like in progressive taxation, and all symbols, hammer and sickle everywhere, and communism is outlawed. So the right wing here very much constantly knows that communism for people and basic social services are somehow connected. So if they can't allow either of them, and so they have to first fight you ideologically, destroy any attempt to reimagine the past, right? Question. And then, because if you do that, then you're going to start questioning a lot of their reforms. So it's very combined. And this is like what we had an interview about how communization became criminalized in Europe, which was led by the Poland and the Baltic states, who are like these sort of avant-garde, radical vanguard of the I think pretty much fascist right wing, right? And so they go and they try to outlaw everything related to communism, try to make it equivalent to fascism, and like stories of like victims of communism, like people were put in like Holocaust camps, and then tying that into everything social being related to that. So if you're like, hey, you should have like free lunch for kids who are starving because it's so poor, right. It's like most of it's a huge 1/4 of the country, or 1/6 of the country, I think, is getting social services, and most others are applying double or triple that and not getting it, and so people are that they're very poor, not just poor, catastrophic situation.
On the political level, we have quite different situation compared with, I would say, East European countries, because of the first reason I will add to your list of the reasons why left why left disappeared generally from politics in Eastern Europe is that exactly left-wing parties were the parties which conducted neoliberal reforms in Eastern Europe. This is a big problem, because it is still alive with the understandings of the people, because they, in my opinion, they felt themselves betrayed in some sense. But the general problem is that the working class, the class consciousness, in Eastern Europe, there is no class consciousness among the working people. There is, I don't know, it's a reason the reason because the Soviet Union was a classless society, and it contributed to the process of eradicating of class consciousness among the working people, or it's another reason, it is another discussion maybe, but without the class consciousness, it's quite difficult to gather, to organize working people, and also the deindustrialization and disappearance of mass employment places, and for example, factories, and so on and so on. It also contributed to the disappearance of organized workers. Sopo is the best example of it, how difficult it is to organize the people, because in my opinion, exactly the working people should become again the biggest leverage and biggest supporter of the idea to introduce some social reforms and introduce some social change. The same was also U.S. For example, what we were talking about right-wing populists. And we know that the biggest supporter of Trump have been the working people, white working people, in the Rust Belt, from Rust Belt and so on. Because they, I don't know how the class consciousness, if class consciousness is still alive in American workers, but in some extent, yes, more than in Georgia, I'm not sure. And this, this disappearance of this class understanding also contributed to Georgian politicians, I would say, not people, advisors from some international financial organizations, but Georgian politicians to conduct such kind of radical neoliberal reforms in Georgia, because there was no opposite.
So what was like maybe like a surprise for you? Like something that when you were researching, I mean, you've already written so extensively before about socialism and this post-socialist world, but what was like a surprise that you weren't expecting when you were compiling all the data and writing all the parts, and which I love that you have multiple parts of critique of the transition. What was the surprise for you?
So I think one of the things that surprised me was in the public opinion data. So, which was done, it was the Life in Transition survey, which was done in 3 waves by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting was that the data showed that public trust had plummeted, and that people felt that most people in their country were worse off. But the same data showed that most people thought that they were better off. So when they asked about you individually, many people reported that I'm actually doing pretty well, but my country is a shambles. And I thought that was interesting, right? That contradiction really sort of highlighted some of the reason why this J-curve narrative and the disaster capitalism narrative could be coexisting at the same time. That surprised me, that people, because especially when I'm, in Bulgaria or in Serbia, people really complain a lot about how bad things are. So it was really interesting for me to hear that there are actually people out there who are pretty happy with their lives despite what's going on now. Of course, obviously, this is all before the pandemic, so I don't know how it would change, but the data that we looked at, I thought that surprised me. I don't know, Mitchell, what surprised you?
The thing that surprised me the most, honestly, in this book was that economists, when we started looking at just how far economists didn't trust their own data, and basically said, when they look at the Georgia data, for instance, on the economy, which I just looked at, they would say, well, we don't actually think that the Depression was that great, because we don't know what the starting point was, because they measured it differently, right? So they don't trust their own data about the transition. And at the same time, they refuse steadfastly to look at anybody else's data. I think that was the thing that shocked me the most, is like just the way that there's like been a whole movement to sort of cover up the economic data, the depth of the badness of the economic data, by just saying, we don't really believe that that's true. But then not really taking on board the demographic data, which also shows this kind of collapse, right? And the outmigration data, which also shows, kind of collapse. So that just said to me, I don't know, that paradigms and ideologies are very powerful and causes people to be blind totally to things that they see right in front of their heads. I can't tell you how many times I've talked about this to people and said, oh, I guess you wouldn't think, because you're sort of social democrats like us, but if you look at, people are like, oh yeah, that makes me think of the lady who lived next door, like the old lady who lived next door who really suffered throughout this transition, right? That makes me think of, and people just didn't, they obviously saw those people, they walked by them every day, but they didn't think that there was like an economic collapse happening, because they're experiencing this kind of regeneration, right?
Can you just shortly explain us the correlation between this shock therapy, neoliberal reform, and the development of democracy? Because in my first years when I started to teach at the university, my themes was democratization. Like it was quite popular to this time to talk about democratization and so on. And one opinion was quite common and quite popular among the political scientists to this time, that market reform will bring automatically democracy. And it emerged as the wrongest notion at all. And can you explain this from your point of view? Can you explain this misunderstanding or failure of not only of scientists but politicians and reformists, that the neoliberal reforms, market reforms will bring automatically the democracy in the country?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's super complex question, but let me just say one thing from a simple, again, rhetorical point of view. Obviously, neoliberalism did not bring democracy everywhere. It didn't, right? I mean, if you look in the post-Soviet space, which of these countries is a democracy? It's not. And so, so again, that's a way to start, levering into sort of tearing apart this kind of association. Obviously, they wanted to claim that neoliberalism will bring everything positive, right? Everything good is because of neoliberalism, and to some extent, there is this like theoretical association in liberal theory between liberal economy and, liberal society, right? And there is that, but at the same time, there are also tensions, obviously, between neoliberal economic approaches and democracy. In fact, one of those tensions is the increase of inequality that we talk about in the book, right? That democracies are assumed in our literature and political science to produce more equality. But actually in the post-communist societies, they've produced more inequality, right? And I've reviewed a book recently, by Karakoç. He's like a Turkish scholar working in the US, about that. That's pretty interesting to read, about how actually democracy produced more inequality, not only in post-communist countries, but also in Southern Europe, in Turkey and Spain as well. And so I guess that the short answer would be there are arguments for it. Maybe there's a supportive arguments and also opposing arguments, right? So that it's uncertain what the effect of neoliberalism is on democracy. It has in some ways it supports it, in some ways it opposes it.
In Georgia, there was an understanding that, the freedom is equal property. And if you have the property, you have the freedom. It means the democracy, no? Democracy is equal the freedom, and freedom is equal the property.
Yeah, that's a classical liberal perspective. Yeah. John Locke or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I just think that's part of the neoliberal ideology, that somehow freedom of private property and what you call the second primitive accumulation is somehow correlated with democracy. The way that it's correlated with democracy is that if you have enough money, you can buy the elections, which is what happens in most East European countries. And to the extent that most elections are now, even in the United States, these really expensive things where it's not really about representation of the people or the constituency, but about paying for ads on television, what suits you wear, and who is better at spinning or slinging mud at the other guy. I mean, most elections in most countries are just manipulation of the population for a brief period of time, and then the results come in, and then it's business as usual again. I mean, that's what we've seen. And so, that's why the populists are having the success that they are. And so to the extent that private property means democracy, it means the kind of democracy where money matters. And I think that's what we need to talk about. Because democracy is not only democracy where the richest guy wins. It's also supposed to be the idea that the people have a say in their system of government. At least that's what I learned when I was at primary school. And I don't think that I don't think anywhere really in the world do we really live in systems where ordinary people have a say in their system of government, including in the United States. There were all these studies about how much more a vote from a rich person counts somebody who's wealthy than an ordinary worker. And I think that's, this is what Mitchell said earlier about attacking the neoliberal narrative is a really good point. I think that's really important, but you have to connect it with this critique of classical liberal democracy, which is that somehow one individual vote of individual people coming together could actually change things. Because I sort of, I'm beginning to become rather cynical, especially I've just been in Bulgaria where they had elections, they've had the same prime minister for a bunch of years. His government resigned. They had elections. They've given 3 different parties a mandate. They can't form a government. They've had a caretaker government for some months now. Now they're going to have new elections. And it's all people are just fed up, right, with this. And it's not going to change anything. Everybody in Bulgaria, anybody who has any sense who can get out leaves, because as you say, they have a possibility to go to the European Union. And so there's this massive exodus. That's why 50% of the population might eventually leave Bulgaria. These just empty the whole country out. It's because of this weird connection between neoliberalism and what is really the Potemkin democracy that many East European countries got after 1989. Because let's face it, Western advisors in the World Bank and in the EBRD and in the IMF and even in the EU and USAID, they were much more concerned with setting up market economies so they could export goods to Eastern Europe and make, extract profits and extract working labor, doctors and nurses and caregivers and all the people that they need to tend to their old people and their graying economies. Did they really care about setting up democracies? No, that was just the veneer, because they needed political parties in power who would implement neoliberal reforms. Especially I'm sitting here, in Serbia, not very far from the parliament where I'm staying. And there were just a bunch of politicians posing for some photo shoot in front of the parliament in their fancy suits, in their fancy Mercedes parked up on the sidewalk. And it's like, that's what you get, right? It's not what people were sold, right? The idea that these would be representative governments where people would actually have a say in the way that their countries were being governed. That was the ideal. I think that the Americans exported that ideal. I will say that many Americans believe in that ideal. I think a lot of people still believe in that ideal, but is that the reality? It's not in most East European countries, and I don't think it's necessarily in the United States anymore either, which is what January 6th kind of showed us that, right?
Yeah, it's fair to critique democracy, obviously, and the dysfunctions of democracy, but I think the question's coming from a somewhat different standpoint, which is like, there's also a difference between democracy and authoritarianism. Right?
Sure.
And so I think the American democracy, for instance, is fairly dysfunctional right now. But would I rather have Trump be dictator for 20 years? No.
No, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's why, neoliberals will say, look, the more successful the economy, right? They believe that the more they implement their policies, everybody's going to be richer, and then democracy will get better, which is probably true, except that for the piece that their policies don't really produce, positive economic changes that everybody needs, right? I think for the economy, we came down in the book and talking about, more inclusive economy, right? So that you can't deny, right, that the neoliberal policies have helped some people. Some people have been helped, right? The problem is they didn't help the majority of the people, right? And to make democracies survive in a lot of these countries, you need economic policies that at the very least, serve the interests of the majority of people. And that's kind of how we end up framing it in the conclusion.
But isn't it, you mentioned this a few times, Mitchell, that there's lived experiences that are, some are successful and some are bad. And I think, isn't that the critique of capitalism, that it's only good for you, right? So like, in a way, this is like, a gilded age for some people. But in reality, if you compare on, on the whole, and unfortunately, we have to compare on the whole, because individuals can do better. They have emigrated, they have stayed here, they have found ways, to be rich. But even like an example of my family I could take, where I feel like there is like my family in the Soviet Union, which was very close. There wasn't much difference between them as far as money or status, or at least like not as much.
Yeah.
Much more coherent, much more loving, much more together. Now, no one speaks to each other. There's different classes. Some are in the rural area, some are in urban. They don't even have money sometimes to travel to Tbilisi. So it's like the social fabric of just my family has severely, been ripped.
Yeah.
And it's just there are neighborhoods, there are everywhere where friends no longer are friends. And one of the saddest things actually that, when I came back, I lived in the US for 22 years, and then I came back here. And so I have the pleasure of having two countries that are insane.
Yeah.
So like I came back, and then I noticed a lot of like older women who were raised in the Soviet Union. One of their biggest pain was that they couldn't visit their friends and family anymore, because traditionally you bring like a gift, like a little chocolate or something when you visit, and it's sort of considered rude if you don't bring something.
Yeah.
And so they didn't have the money to bring something to visit. And so because of that shame, or they didn't have enough to invite them, or maybe they were, ashamed of their having no renovations anymore in their homes, or things like that, that even the poverty has taken a huge toll on, of just visiting each other, basic sociability. Yeah. And so like, even like we had like visa liberalization with EU, and I was doing door knocking, and I had asked this pensioner, I was like, what do you think about visa liberalization? And she's like, visa liberalization with Europe? She's like, I can't even go down to the town center with the money I make from the pension, let alone Europe. And then when you look at the numbers of who actually used visa liberalization a few years ago, it was like under 10%. Use the visa-free travel. That means most people were not traveling at all, because they didn't have the ability to travel unless they emigrate, So like, I think like, I just want to like, I don't think we can just say the individual, because I think these people came with whole communities that have been deteriorating.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, I mean, we definitely are cognizant of that, Kristen brought that up a lot, this issue of sociability and how that was lost, in the communist era. And, it's definitely lost in capitalism in general. It's something that was, maybe unique to that type of society, where everybody was kept on an equal. But I would just say that the more equality you have, in the economy, the more, people will, in a similar family will, be able to interact with one another, right? And in society as a whole. So like, it was funny, my family, like I have an extended family in the US, okay? And at the beginning of the COVID epidemic, we actually had a big family call where all of our extended relatives got on this Zoom call, and started talking about like how they're dealing with the pandemic and such, And my anticipation would be that some people were really having a tough time, because I know a lot of people were suffering. But in my family, nobody really was having a difficult time. Almost everybody in my family was, working online. They transitioned to work online. They were in jobs that were, not super wealthy jobs, but like middle-class jobs where, that you could basically transition to working online, whether you're a school teacher, which I guess would be like an average middle-class job in the United States, right? Or if you're, a shopkeeper or, a consultant or professor or whatever. And, not that my family's so representative, but it struck me that was kind of like, wow, like I can't believe everybody's having this like relatively similar experience, And so, that's the thing, is if you have a functional economy where people are actually making money, at some level, you can have, a certain degree of that, right? But where you have a society where I guess what you're describing is there's an extremely wealthy elite, or in the cities, and then you have like the majority in the countryside that are just living in this kind of like hell, like, yeah, of course you can't really have that type of sociability even within families, and it is a problem. And I suspect that most people see it as a problem, to some extent.
I will say, though, that the sociality thing is something that really came out in the ethnographic chapter in the book. So to come back to the book a little bit, that was something that I felt really strongly about, because in all of my research and in all of my review of the public opinion data, one of the things that's really clear, and we make this point in the book, is that public trust has plummeted. And there was just a beautiful article in Reuters a couple days ago talking about how low the vaccination rate is in Bulgaria, for instance. Hospital rooms are overflowing. They're running out of ventilators. The Bulgarian government is now having to ship COVID patients outside of Bulgaria to neighboring hospitals because it's so bad in Bulgaria. And they're wasting doses. They have all these doses. It's the lowest vaccination rate in Europe. And the problem is, it's about public trust. Like the society, like all of those links, those connections that people had to each other, to their families, to their friends, to their neighbors, to their colleagues, to their fellow students, all of those connections were profoundly frayed by the catastrophes that followed the collapse of socialism. And I think that, again, because economists can't put a dollar value on those things, they don't know how to measure the importance and the salience of those things to the way that people experience the transition. Again, and this is where you have these very disparate narratives of the transition, whether it's J-curve or disaster capitalism, because I think that there are all these sort of ways in which people related to each other, ways in which people shared with each other, with people supported each other, people visited each other, people talked to each other, people had solidarity with each other, that didn't create economic value for GDP. And so it turns out that economists don't care about it if it doesn't produce value for the GDP that can be measured in a concrete way. But the experience of the loss of that is immense for people. And I think that what you're saying, and certainly, what I hear in terms of the narratives around public distrust and just what's happening with COVID, I mean, I can speak very personally about, being in Bulgaria with friends or my ex-brother and sister-in-law and my nephew who aren't vaccinated, and listening to their narratives of why they're not getting vaccinated, even as their friends and colleagues are literally dying of COVID in the hospital. It's like a society that has kind of gone mad about not knowing who to trust and believing that everybody is constantly out to get you. Because let's face it, for the last 30 years, they have been out to get you. So it's really, really hard to process what's going on. I mean, I think it's catastrophic in some ways, the massive level of distrust and social dysfunction that is characterizing these societies right now. I, in fact, was hoping to be able to travel to Albania, but the EU has just put Albania on an E-list because of the COVID situation there. It's like, you can never come into the EU now if you've spent, any time. If you touch foot in an E-list country, you're like tarred for, at least you have to find an EU country that will let you in for 14 days before you can travel on. So it's crazy what's happening in this part of the world. And I think that a lot of it is related back to this sort of social fissures that you were just describing in your own family, among your colleagues and friends. I mean, I think those things are really important to pay attention to. And to the extent that we address them in the book, we do address them to a certain extent in the public opinion chapter, but much more fine-grained, detailed way in the ethnographic chapter.
I was going to say one thing I really like that was a theme in your book was the way that, you were trying to center the fact that the transition was overseen by hyper-ideological economists who had no ability to take anything into consideration. And actually, I thought that was a really important thing, especially in trying to make sense of the Georgian situation, because of how ideological sometimes this transition is still seen, even if they can say that, there have been these social catastrophes and things are bad, but there is this idealized view of neoliberalism and neoliberal capitalism that was, pushed down people's throats, even though, and I think you have this quote about how even though to make the idealized markets exist, they had to use, unorthodox means, to bring the markets into existence. So this way that you have this kind of these duplicitous transitionists who are, whether they know it or not, or maybe they're duped by their own, they're drunk on their own ideology. They're really, depending on how you read it. But anyway, I thought that this theme was really, and it's sort of you're touching on it, that they had no ability to make sense of the social dynamic, the social fabric, the institutional inability, or there's this part where you mentioned they had this idea that the post-communist individual was going to be somehow immediately ready for markets, that they would somehow become, homo economicus, that they were going to just eventually or just rapidly become somebody whose whole past was going to be gone.
Well, I think that, I just want to just jump on exactly what you said, this homo economicus idea, because that comes back to this thing that I was talking about earlier about the convergence theory, that there's somehow there was this whole narrative in the 50s and 60s around modernization theory, which is that certain societies have enterprising individuals who will come forth and be the kind of Ayn Randian individuals that will bring markets to life and be entrepreneurs or whatever. And I think that there was really truly a fantasy among many of these mostly American, but also West European economists and transition experts, and some of them were lawyers as well, advisors, largely speaking, that believed that that person, those people were lying latent in these societies. And then all you had to do was take off the lid of communism, the oppression of communism, and these beautiful entrepreneurial people would spring forth, and you would have markets and capitalism. And, again, I think, okay, that is in of itself a very highly ideological frame of mind to have. That's no different than, the old communists and the socialists saying that people are inherently good and everybody wants to be cooperative and share. And all we have to do is get rid of the superstructure of capitalism and people's natural human nature will come out and we'll all live in happy little communes or whatever, right? So I think in both cases, there's a sort of ideological view about the state of human nature, about the natural inclinations of people that ends up driving what are very real policy recommendations without thinking for a second. This is why, as an ethnographer, I go crazy that that these ideas of the human capacity aren't in some way culturally bound or culturally rooted, depending on history and religion and gender. And to think that there's a universal raw nugget of a human that functions the same way in all context, which is basically what many economists tend to do, is to think of that homo economicus in that way. I mean, that's the issue that I find really problematic when we're talking about policy making. And I mean, it's the universalisms, the irony of what happened, I think, in the 90s, and Mitchell has written really wonderfully about neoliberal reform in Eastern Europe. But the irony is that they replaced one universalism, the universalism of socialism or communism, with the universalism of neoliberalism, without really processing that these projects were both profoundly flawed in their kind of, it's not just the eradication of the individual as an autonomous functioning thing, but the eradication of society, the eradication of culture, the eradication of difference. They wanted to homogenize everything. And that turned out to be a disaster in the case of Eastern Europe, where they took all these neoliberal programs that they had tested in Latin America And we write about this in the book and say, oh, well, they worked in Latin America, so we'll just take them from Argentina and Chile and Bolivia, wherever, and we'll just plop them down over here and hopefully they'll work the same way. I mean, that was just so, again, as an ethnographer, it's like, seriously? Do you have any sense of the differences between these different cultures and histories? And the answer was generally no. Markets work the same, people work the same in capitalism everywhere you go.
ჩემს მომავალს იბერეს ხედარ დაუკითხავად გულში შემოდის ფარული სელოდა ჩიტო გრიტო ჩიტო მარგალიტო და ჩიტო გრიტო ჩიტო მარგალიტო და ჩემი სიმღერა ებმა მასწავლეს ჩიტების ტლერა ასე მგონია ამ სიმღერებით ავიდგიერა როგორც ამბობენ სიცოცხლის ბოლოს თუ მღერის გეთი სიმღერით მოკვდე რაღაცა დრო ამაზე მეტი